So here's the thing nobody wants to talk about. Sometimes when you threaten to leave someone, they actually let you go. And then you're sitting there like an idiot, wondering how the hell you got here. I'm Marlena, I'm 37, and I just found out the hard way that my husband Harold actually meant it when he said okay to our separation. Like, who does that? Look, I need to get this off my chest because everyone keeps acting like I'm the bad guy here. And honestly, I'm getting really tired of it. Harold and I were together for 10 years, and we have these two amazing boys who are 8 and 5. I was a stay-at-home mom, which was supposed to be this beautiful thing where I got to raise our kids while he went out and handled the work stuff. That was our agreement. I'd take care of the home front, and he'd bring in the money. Simple, right? But here's what nobody understands. Being home all day isn't this perfect little bubble everyone thinks it is. It's exhausting and lonely, and honestly, most days I felt like I was losing my mind. Harold would leave for work every morning looking all put together and professional, and I'd be there in my pajamas trying to figure out what to do with myself. The kids were in school most of the day, so it wasn't like I was constantly chasing toddlers around. But still, people act like staying home is this easy job, but they don't get it. So yeah, I started sleeping in more. Sue me. If I didn't have to be anywhere at a specific time, why should I force myself to get up at 6 in the morning? Harold was already up anyway, making breakfast and getting the boys ready for school. He seemed to have this whole routine down, and honestly, it worked better when I wasn't in there getting in the way. Sometimes I'd roll out of bed in time to drive them to school, sometimes I wouldn't. It depended on how I was feeling that day. And before you start judging me, let me explain something. Harold never complained about this arrangement. Never once did he say, "Hey, I need help with the morning routine," or "Can you please get up and help me?" He just did it. So how was I supposed to know he had a problem with it? I'm not a mind reader. If he wanted me to do something different, he should have said something, instead of just quietly resenting me for years. The same thing happened with bedtime routines. Harold would come home from work, and after dinner, he'd automatically start the whole bedtime process with the boys. Reading stories, getting them in their pajamas, making sure they brushed their teeth. Again, he never asked for help. He just did it. And I figured he liked having that time with them, Father-son bonding and all that. I'd usually be in the living room watching TV or scrolling through my phone, decompressing from my day. Look, I know how that sounds, but you have to understand, I needed that downtime. Being responsible for a household is mentally exhausting, even if you're not actively doing stuff every second. There's always something in the back of your mind, some worry about the kids or the house or whatever. So yeah, I spent my evenings on my phone or watching videos. That was my way of shutting my brain off for a few hours. Weekend mornings were the same deal. Harold would get up with the boys, make them breakfast, and then they'd go do activities together. Parks, sports stuff, whatever. Sometimes they'd ask if I wanted to come, but honestly, I was tired. I needed to sleep in on weekends. That's like the whole point of weekends, right? Resting and recharging. Harold seemed fine, taking them places by himself, and the boys never complained, so I didn't see the problem. But apparently there was a problem. A big one. Because after years of this routine, Harold started getting weird and distant. He'd come home from work and barely talk to me. He'd handle the kids' stuff, and then disappear into his office or go to bed early. When I tried to talk to him about his day, he'd give me these short, clipped answers like he didn't want to be bothered. And then he started asking me all these questions about what I did during the day. Like, invasive questions. Where did I go? Who did I talk to? What did I do with my time? It felt like he was checking up on me or something, which was super uncomfortable. I mean, I'm an adult. I don't need to account for every minute of my day to anyone. But whenever he asked me stuff like that, I'd ask him the same questions back, and suddenly he'd get all defensive and change the subject. Talk about double standards. The whole thing started feeling really off balance. Here I was, trying to be a good wife and mother, managing the household and raising our kids, and Harold was acting like I wasn't pulling my weight or something. Which was ridiculous, because hello, I gave up my career to be home with our family. That was a sacrifice I made for us, for our marriage, for our kids. But instead of appreciating that, he seemed to be building up all this resentment toward me. I tried to figure out what was wrong, but every time I brought it up, Harold would just say everything was fine. Classic guy move, right? Bottle everything up and then act all surprised when things explode later. If he had issues with how things were working, he should have said something years ago, instead of letting it build up like this. How was I supposed to fix problems I didn't even know existed? So there we were, stuck in this weird dynamic where he was clearly unhappy but wouldn't talk about it. And I was trying to hold our family together while walking on eggshells around his moods. The boys started noticing too, which broke my heart. They'd ask me why Daddy seemed sad, or why Mommy and Daddy weren't talking much anymore. What was I supposed to tell them? That their father was having some kind of midlife crisis and taking it out on our family? Looking back now, I can see that we were both withdrawing from each other. But at the time, it felt like Harold was the one pulling away. I was still there, still trying to connect with him, still wanting to work things out. But he'd built up this wall, and nothing I did seemed to get through to him. The first time I threatened to leave, it wasn't even a real threat. It was more like, I don't know how to explain it. It was like trying to show him how serious things had gotten. We'd been having this argument about his family coming to visit, and I said I needed them to stay at a hotel instead of our house because I wasn't feeling up to hosting. Which seems reasonable, right? I was going through a lot emotionally, dealing with his distance and coldness, and the last thing I needed was to play hostess to his parents for a week. But Harold got all stubborn about it, saying they'd already made plans to stay with us, and it would be rude to change things last minute. He wasn't listening to me at all, wasn't considering how I might be feeling or what I might need. So I told him that if he cared more about his parents' comfort than his wife's well-being, maybe we had bigger problems than I thought. Maybe I should just pack up and leave if that's how little my feelings mattered to him. I expected him to pause, to realize that he was being insensitive and that we needed to find a compromise. Instead, he just stared at me for a minute and then said fine, his parents could get a hotel room. But he said it in this cold, detached way that made it clear he was only doing it to shut me up, not because he actually understood where I was coming from. That should have been my first clue that something was really wrong. In the past, when we'd fight, Harold would get emotional too. We'd both get heated, and then we'd talk it out and make up. But this time, it was like he didn't even care enough to fight with me properly. He just gave in to avoid the conflict, which somehow felt worse than if he'd stood his ground. After that, I started noticing how Harold would shut down whenever I tried to bring up problems in our relationship. If I said I felt disconnected from him, he'd just nod and say, okay, without offering any solutions. If I mentioned that I felt like we were drifting apart, he'd agree, but not suggest anything we could do about it. It was like he'd already checked out of our marriage and was just going through the motions. So yeah, I started bringing up the possibility of separation more often. Not because I wanted to leave, but because I needed him to understand how close we were to losing everything. When someone you love is pulling away from you, sometimes you have to show them what life would be like without you. It's not manipulation, it's communication. It's saying this is where we're headed if we don't figure this out. But Harold's responses got weirder and weirder. Instead of fighting for us, instead of saying, no, I don't want that, let's work on this, he'd just get quiet and withdrawn. Sometimes he'd agree that maybe we weren't compatible anymore. Who says that? Who agrees that their marriage might be over, instead of fighting tooth and nail to save it? I kept thinking he'd snap out of it, that eventually he'd realize what he was doing to our family and step up to fix things. I gave him so many opportunities to choose us, to choose me. Every time I brought up how unhappy I was, every time I mentioned that maybe we'd be better off apart, I was really asking him to prove that our marriage mattered to him. But he never did. He just kept agreeing with me in this flat, emotionless way that made me feel like I was talking to a wall. The breaking point came when I told our oldest son about the possibility of divorce. I know how that sounds, but you have to understand the context. Harold and I had just had another one of those awful conversations where I was practically begging him to care about our relationship, and he just sat there like a statue. I was so frustrated and hurt that I needed someone to understand what I was going through. And when our 8-year-old asked me why Mommy and Daddy were acting weird, I told him the truth, that sometimes grown-ups have problems they can't fix, and sometimes that means families change. Harold absolutely lost it when he found out I'd talked to our son about it. He said I had no right to involve the kids in our problems, that I was being selfish and destructive. Which was rich, coming from the guy who'd been emotionally abandoning his family for months. I told him that the kids weren't stupid, that they could sense the tension between us, and that maybe if he'd actually tried to work on our marriage instead of giving up on it, we wouldn't be in this position. That's when I told him that I was done with his indifference, done with feeling like I was the only one who cared about saving our family. I said if he wanted to act like our marriage didn't matter, then maybe it didn't. Maybe we should just get separated and stop pretending we had something worth fighting for. I was hoping, God, I was really hoping, that would finally wake him up, that he'd realize what he was about to lose, and start acting like a husband who wanted to stay married. Instead, he looked at me with this calm, almost relieved expression and said, "You're right. We should separate." Just like that. 10 years of marriage, 2 kids, a whole life together, and he was ready to throw it all away because I'd finally gotten honest about how broken things had become. The morning after I told Harold we should separate, I woke up expecting him to be devastated. I thought he'd have spent the night thinking about what I'd said, realizing how much he'd regret losing our family, ready to have a real conversation about how to fix things. Instead, I found him in the kitchen making breakfast for the boys, like it was any other day. He was calm, almost cheerful, humming while he poured cereal and packed lunchboxes. When I tried to talk to him about our conversation the night before, expecting him to say he'd been thinking and didn't want to separate after all, he just looked at me and said, "I think you're right. We should move forward with the separation." Like it was a business decision or something. Like our 10-year marriage and 2 children were just items on a to-do list that he could check off and move on from. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for him to break down and admit he didn't really want this. But as the days went by, Harold seemed more relaxed and content than I'd seen him in months. He was still doing all the same things with the kids, school drop-offs, bedtime stories, weekend activities, but now he seemed genuinely happy doing them instead of going through the motions like he had been. Meanwhile, I was falling apart. I'd call him at work crying, trying to explain that I hadn't meant what I said, that I was just frustrated and wanted him to fight for us. But he'd just listen quietly, and then say something like, "I understand you're upset, but I think this is for the best." For the best? How could breaking up our family possibly be for the best? I tried everything to get through to him. I showed up at his office one day to talk face to face, thinking maybe he'd be more receptive if we weren't at home with all the tension and history. But his coworkers kept giving me these pitying looks, and Harold seemed embarrassed that I was there. He walked me to the parking lot and very calmly explained that he'd already talked to a lawyer and would be moving out within the month. A lawyer. He'd already talked to a lawyer without telling me. While I was at home, trying to figure out how to save our marriage, he was meeting with lawyers about how to end it. That's when it really hit me that this wasn't some temporary reaction to our fight. Harold had been planning this, maybe for months, and my threat to leave had just given him the perfect excuse to do what he'd already decided to do. The worst part was watching how the separation affected our boys. They kept asking when Daddy was coming home, why he was sleeping at that apartment across town, whether they'd done something wrong. And Harold, God, this still makes me so angry. Harold seemed fine with all of it. He'd pick them up for his scheduled time looking perfectly content, take them out for fun activities, and bring them back talking about what a great time they'd had. It was like he'd compartmentalized everything. Work life, dad life, and whatever this new separated life was, all in neat little boxes that didn't touch each other. But I couldn't compartmentalize. I was living in the wreckage of our family, trying to explain to our children why their parents couldn't be in the same room together anymore, dealing with lawyers and paperwork, and all the practical nightmare of untangling a decade of shared life. I kept thinking he'd come to his senses, that he'd realize what he was doing to our family and come home ready to work on things. I gave him so many opportunities to change his mind. When he came to pick up the boys, I'd try to start conversations about us, about whether we could try counseling, whether we could take things slow and see if we could fix what was broken. But Harold had this new way of talking to me, all polite and distant, like I was some acquaintance he barely knew. He'd say things like, "I think it's better if we keep our conversations focused on the kids," or "I don't think rehashing the past is productive for either of us." Who talks like that to someone they were married to for 10 years? The really twisted part was that everyone kept telling me how mature Harold was being about the separation. His family, our mutual friends, even my own sister, they all kept praising him for handling things so calmly and putting the kids first. Like his complete emotional detachment was something admirable instead of devastating. Nobody seemed to understand that his calmness wasn't maturity. It was indifference. I started wondering if there was someone else. Not because I had any evidence, but because I couldn't understand how someone could switch off their feelings so completely unless they had somewhere else to direct them. I went through his social media, checked his credit card statements, even drove by his apartment a few times to see if there were any signs of another woman. But there was nothing. Harold really seemed to just be done. That was almost worse than if there had been someone else. At least then I could understand his behavior. Could blame it on some homewrecker who'd seduced him away from his family. But this was just Harold deciding that our marriage wasn't worth saving and moving on like it had never mattered to him at all. The divorce proceedings were surreal. Harold was cooperative and reasonable about everything: custody schedules, property division, spousal support. He agreed to most of what I asked for without argument, which should have been a relief, but somehow made everything worse. It was like he couldn't wait to finalize everything and close this chapter of his life for good. 6 months after our divorce was finalized, I saw Harold at our son's soccer game with a woman I didn't recognize. She was pretty in an understated way, probably around my age, with the kind of natural confidence that I'd always envied in other women. She was cheering for our boys, high-fiving them when they ran over during halftime, laughing at something Harold said while keeping her eyes on the field. And Harold looked happy, really, genuinely happy in a way I hadn't seen in years. He had his arm around this woman's shoulders, was smiling and joking with other parents, seemed completely at ease in a way he never had during the last few years of our marriage. It was like watching a completely different person, someone I barely recognized as the man I'd been married to. After the game, the boys ran over to introduce me to Daddy's friend Sarah. She was warm and friendly, complimented me on how well-behaved and sweet the boys were, asked if I wanted to grab coffee sometime to chat about coordinating schedules. She treated me like any other co-parent she might encounter, without a trace of awkwardness or competitiveness. It would have been easier to hate her if she'd been nasty or territorial, but she was just nice. Genuinely nice. I found out later that Sarah was a teacher at the boys' school, that she and Harold had started talking during pickup times, and slowly developed a friendship that had turned into something more. She'd been divorced for a couple of years herself, had a daughter around our boy's age, and from what I could tell, she treated Harold with the kind of easy affection and respect that made their relationship look effortless. Watching them together was torture, but I couldn't stop myself from observing them at school events and games. Sarah would bring snacks for both families, would coordinate with Harold about carpooling, would genuinely celebrate our boys' achievements like they were her own kids. And Harold responded to her attention with this relaxed gratitude that made me realize how tense and demanding I must have seemed in comparison. The boys loved her, which was maybe the hardest part of all. They'd come home from Harold's weekend visits, talking about the fun things they'd done with Miss Sarah, how she'd helped them with art projects, or taken them to museums, or taught them card games. She wasn't trying to replace me. She was careful to refer to me as their mom and encourage them to tell me about their activities, but she was clearly becoming a significant presence in their lives. I tried dating too, but it was a disaster. I'd go on these dates expecting to feel the way Harold clearly felt with Sarah. Excited, hopeful, ready to start fresh. Instead, I found myself comparing every man to Harold, getting irritated when they didn't understand my references to our shared history, feeling exhausted by the thought of explaining my whole life story to someone new. And the practical side of being divorced was so much harder than I'd expected. Having to work full-time for the first time in years, managing a household budget on just my income plus spousal support, dealing with repairs and maintenance and all the stuff Harold used to handle. I'd never realized how much he'd been carrying until I had to carry it all myself. The loneliness was crushing. Not just missing Harold, but missing the idea of being part of a family unit. Coming home to an empty house, half the time, when the boys were at their dad's, eating dinner alone, having nobody to share the little daily moments with. I'd catch myself starting to text Harold about something funny one of the boys had said, then remembering that we weren't those people to each other anymore. Meanwhile, Harold seemed to be thriving in every area of his life. He got a promotion at work, started coaching our younger son's baseball team, bought a bigger house where the boys each had their own room. And Sarah was right there beside him, this perfect partner who made everything look easy and fun. I heard through mutual friends that Harold had started therapy during our separation, that he'd been working on himself and dealing with issues he'd never talked about during our marriage. Part of me was angry that he'd never been willing to do that work while we were together, but mostly I was just devastated that he'd been capable of growth and change all along. He just hadn't wanted to do it for me. The final blow came when I overheard our older son talking to his friend about how much happier his dad seemed now, how Daddy smiles all the time, and how much fun it was at his house with Sarah and her daughter. He wasn't trying to hurt me. He was just an 8-year-old sharing his observations. But it confirmed what I'd been trying not to acknowledge. Harold's life had genuinely improved after our divorce. I spent months trying to figure out where I'd gone wrong, what I could have done differently, how I'd managed to lose the man I thought I knew so well. But the more I thought about it, the angrier I got, not at myself, but at him. Because the truth is, I'd been a good wife. I'd given up my career to raise our children, had managed our household, had tried to support him even when he was being distant and cold. Harold was the one who'd given up without really trying, who'd chosen the easy path of starting over instead of doing the hard work of fixing what we had. And now he got to be the hero of his own story, the guy who'd found happiness with a woman who appreciated him, while I was stuck being the bitter ex-wife who'd driven him away with my impossible demands and dramatic threats. But instead of making me want to examine my own behavior, it just made me angrier. Because if Harold was capable of being that kind of man, attentive, affectionate, present, genuinely happy, then why hadn't he been that way with me? Why had I gotten the withdrawn, resentful, checked-out version while Sarah got the man I'd always wanted him to be? So here I am now, 2 years after that night when I told Harold we should separate, living in a small apartment and working a job I hate, and watching my ex-husband live his best life with a woman who gets the version of him I always wanted, but never had. Everyone keeps telling me I should be happy that he's happy for the sake of our kids, that I should focus on moving forward and building my own new life. But honestly, I'm not happy that he's happy. I'm bitter and resentful and completely mystified by how everything went so wrong so fast. I keep waiting to feel like this new reality is actually my life, but it still feels like some nightmare I'm going to wake up from. I keep expecting Harold to realize what he's lost, to understand that Sarah might be nice and pretty and uncomplicated, but she doesn't have our history, doesn't know him the way I do. Instead, he seems to have decided that our history was baggage he's better off without. and that starting fresh with someone new was preferable to working through problems with someone who actually knew him. I'll never understand how 10 years of marriage, and 2 beautiful children could be so easily discarded in favor of some fantasy relationship with a woman he barely knows. But apparently that's just the kind of person Harold turned out to be. Someone who gives up when things get difficult, instead of fighting for what matters. And I guess I'm better off knowing that about him now, instead of wasting more years trying to save a marriage he never really wanted to be in anyway. Even if it means I'm the one who ends up alone, while he gets his happy ending with someone else.